The following panel is vital in any conversation, and it's a question we get asked time and time again. How do we support a loved one who is struggling with addiction? It's really hard to understand what someone who's struggling with addiction is going through if you personally haven't experienced it. It's a hard journey. It's a hard just track to follow, but we want to empower you in this conversation. It's important to learn how to stay healthy within ourselves, how to approach our loved one with a non-judgmental stance, and how to really continue to reduce the stigma surrounding addiction so that your loved one feels supported, embraced, and cared for throughout what's going to be a very challenging process. So this panel is once again facilitated by our wonderful program manager, Michael Eric Owens, and it's featuring Lisa Harper. She's the program coordinator of prevention services for DCCCA. Lynn Hall, the treatment manager for Turning Point Drug and Alcohol Treatment. And once again, Pastor Ron Scott from Serenity Outreach Community Church. We really hope that you get some skills from this really fantastic panel.
I'm so excited about this panel, supporting a loved one who has an addiction, opioid addiction and so forth. And we know that while the person may be going through battles with addiction, it affects the whole family, it affects the friends and so forth. And so we really want to talk about, how do we, as family members, as clinicians, as those in the field, support someone that's going through this, and maybe there's some personal stories or histories that you can share, but let's just begin to examine how do we do that. And I just send that question to the panel.
Well, I think some important parts of being a support for someone dealing with substance use disorder is trying to be a non-judgmental person who's available to listen. Addiction is a really difficult thing, and we know it both affects the body, a physical dependence, as well as the mind. There's a mental aspect to needing that substance to deal with things. And so it's important to be a non-judgmental person they can come to and say, I'm really struggling today, or I need some extra help. And if they feel like you can't be there to listen and offer compassion and non-judgment, they may not reach out to you in those difficult times. So that's a really important thing that people can do, and kind of learn some of those community resources. If someone does reach out and says, I need some help, knowing how to help connect them. And I'm sure our other panelists have some great resources. And one simple one is 211 to reach out to. If you don't know who's the right connection, you can be an advocate for your friend or family and make that phone call and learn about some resources.
It's also important to understand that addiction is a family disease. It's not necessarily just for that individual with the issue of the addiction, that it affects the family as a whole. So like Lisa said, understanding your resources in your community, understanding your treatment options is very important.
One of the things that I found helpful, and one of the things I think is necessary, is for us to remove the barriers that people get help. So many times, particularly talking about in the faith community, a lot of times people don't feel comfortable telling someone that I have an addiction problem, or as a matter of fact, we try to hide it most of the time anyway. But to know that you have a place where you can go, that you where we can provide a healing climate, so to speak. One of the things that we have done is that we partner with some 12-step groups, and we provide a space and where all the groups can come together, and we try to refer people to that spot. We have Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, all the 12-step programs meet at one place on different nights so that we can create a climate or a place where people can get help. And let them know, because one of the problems that we have that stigma attached to addiction. Like a person is a bad person, they're sorry, you know, all the things he said, instead of saying that they were sick. I know when I was in treatment for drug addiction, the thing that set me free was when I heard somebody say that I was sick. And when they told me I was sick, it seemed like a light came on. And I began to have hope, because I knew if I was sick, that means I can get well. And so I think we just have to make sure that we provide a healing climate in order for people who need help can get help.
Yeah, I like how you said that, Pastor. You know, there's so much stigma around this being a sign of a person's character weakness, that they're not strong enough to resist. And Lisa, you mentioned the physical and also the mental aspect of this, and how important it is to listen. And Lynn, you talked about the family. You know, but you know, while all of those things are wonderful, we find ourselves in the midst where individuals are just feeling so isolated and alone. And what are some of those strategies to listen? You know, I mean, people think that listening is, you know, everybody can do it. Well, I don't think everybody can do it. So what are some of those strategies for someone that simply can be taught how to properly listen?
That is such an important point, Michael. Listening sounds so simple, but can be very hard, especially when it's someone you love and all you want to do is help or fix. And that's kind of our natural tendency as humans to say, well, here, let's just do this and it'll fix it and we'll all move on and it'll be fine. Listening is not about you. It's about the other person and you being there for them. So that can look like when they're telling you, when I have X problem, it makes me feel like I need to use. Your role isn't to say, you don't need to use in that moment. Your job is to stay quiet and listen. Why do you feel that way? Help me understand why you think that would help you feel better in that time. Ask them questions about their thoughts and their feelings and keep your opinions to yourself. That's not a time for you to say, here's how you fix your problem. It's, let me hear what you're feeling and you're going through. And that's way harder than it sounds, because again, as humans, we want to fix and help. And then when you do get to a step of, okay, I think maybe they're open to reaching out for help, you can say something like, you know, could we look at some resources together? I have some ideas. Could we talk about these? Again, offering it in a compassionate way, not here's what you need to do. Here's how you fix your problem. That cuts off that communication really quickly for somebody.
I think education first. I mean, you can listen to somebody, but if you don't understand the addiction itself, it's hard to listen to something you don't understand. So when you're talking or speaking with families who are dealing with someone with addiction, first thing I would always advise them to do is research and understand what that person is going through, because they have no control over some of that addiction until they get the help that they need. And until the family member understands the addiction process, it's kind of hard to listen. It's kind of hard to understand, because then you begin to be a blamer and telling them how wrong they are and what they need to do. So I think the beginning of a process to listening is understanding. So I always encourage families to understand the addiction process and what it is.
one of the things that's helpful is to never ask why. You know, uh, particularly in the church and in the faith community, we already have preconceived answers when people come to us with problems. But with addiction, this is a different animal, and you really have to listen and be willing to share your experience, strength, and hope also. And once again, that's when we talked about the stigma. I like what was said about this is a family disease, because one of the things in prevention, when we talk with young people, letting them know if you got somebody in your family that has an addiction problem, then chances are you can, for lack of a better word, you can catch it, or it's passed down to you. And so, one of the things that we have to do is really put ourselves in that person's shoes while we're listening. Uh, and if you do that, then you're not tend to come up with the classic answers that so many people, particularly in the faith community, come up with automatically.
When all of you were talking, I mean that's getting educated, listening. Listening's not about about us; it's about them. I mean, what word came to me is empathy. Empathy. I mean, it's you wouldn't blame a person if you can see yourself in them, right? But that's, again, Lisa, that seems to be one of those words that we think is very easy to achieve. But how do we, when we see our loved one, our friend, our colleague going through something, how do we imagine ourselves in that situation, which then can lead us to, of course, wanting to learn, wanting to listen. But let's talk a little bit about that empathy that I think is so needed.
Yeah, and like you said, empathy is one of those things that's easier said than done. Sympathy is when I feel sorry for you. Empathy is when I try to feel with you. So I want to try to feel alongside you. While I can't be in your shoes, how can I try to think, what must it be like that when your body is craving something and you don't want to have to make that choice, but it's so physical that you want that thing? What must that feel like for somebody? That's really hard. And we do know that addiction changes our brains. And so when someone goes through addiction, especially when in the midst of that addiction, the way they make decisions and the way the body is craving things is completely different. So to expect them to act one way when their body and their brain is kind of forcing them to make a different decision, it's hard to have empathy for that, but you have to try to think, what would it be like to have this force, this pull towards something that feels beyond my control, and how can I have some empathy? How can I try to walk next to them, not feel bad for them, but try to feel with them?
Empathy is, I mean, when we're talking about addiction and empathy versus sympathy, addiction is a hard thing for the person who has the addiction. And when you're dealing with family members, caring kind of stumps over that. You want to make them better right now. So the empathy doesn't come at the beginning. It comes later once they understand that person and what they're going through. But as a family member, you want it to just stop. You just want it to just cease. I don't understand it. I don't know why. And until that happens, empathy comes a little later. When I've dealt with families, it's not empathy. It's trying to understand why. And I don't understand, this is not how they were raised or what was implemented in our family. So empathy kind of comes a little later once the understanding of addiction and the process of it. And sometimes, families have a lot of addiction and they choose to ignore it. And then when it hits home, it becomes very hard to deal with. So empathy is great when you can get the family to get there first. and then it comes, and then it usually smooths out after the understanding of addiction. But at the beginning, I haven't really experienced empathy at the beginning, but as we go through the motions of it, then it comes later on.
You know, I think I was listening to Michelle Obama last night, and she talked about empathy. And I believe she put in the words of putting yourself in that person's shoes. I think when it comes to a family member, sometimes it takes somebody outside of the family to be able to show empathy, someone who has walked in that person's shoes. And so sometime in the early stages of recovery, you have to bring someone in who understands what it's like to be in that position. Because like you said, the family, they just want relief. And they don't understand why it can't happen right now. And that's when those words come out, you're weak, you're this, you're that. And because they don't understand. And so, intervention is so important. And it's intervention brings in professionals, somebody that can help with the situation because they've walked in those shoes. But I agree. Sometimes when you first get started, there's no empathy at all. You just want some help. And you want that person to stop, and you don't understand why they can't stop. And that's why education is so important, because like we said earlier, when you're in the throes of addiction, you don't think like everybody else. All you're trying to do is feed that addiction. And then once you finish using all your resources, then that sick, sad, and sorry feeling comes in. And now you're feeling sorry for yourself, and now you're open to anything until you get high again. But to emphasize again, sometimes empathy comes from an outside source.
Addiction has so many emotions. You're angry, you're embarrassed, you're confused. So empathy is usually at the end of the line, unfortunately. But once you get through those mixed emotions with your family members and the embarrassment, then I think the empathy and the sympathy comes, and people try to understand what addiction is and what that person is going through. But you got to get through all of those emotional roller coasters before you can even get there. So
I think it's so important to always remember that we all stumble, and we like for someone to have grace and mercy on us. And being able to extend that to a loved one, I think, is so important. Lynn, you talked about the important question of families wanting to have the why answered, right? Why is this happening? How do you address that, and how do you see progressing from the why into some sort of understanding toward being educated about it? So for each of you, when you hear somebody say, why is this happening? How do you answer that?
for me, when the family is trying to understand the why, sometimes we have to look at the trauma. Sometimes we have to hit things that the family isn't willing to discuss or willing to deal with, but it's usually the trauma in the family. Sometimes the member that has the addiction has that trauma and carries it, and sometimes the family tends to ignore those trauma issues. So we start there. I start with the trauma. If there's trauma, or if there's some type of history of addiction in the family, sometimes that's some of the key points. And sometimes families tend to brush it under the rug, per se, and not deal with those particular traumas in the family.
Lynn, you are so right. As you were talking, I was thinking about I have a very good friend who has a substance use disorder. And when I first learned that, I was definitely the person who didn't understand why was this happening. And as I learned more, I learned there was substance use in the family. There was some undiagnosed mental illness. There were a lot of factors that led to that moment. And you're totally right. You have to understand that as best you can to get to that place of empathy. And there are all these things. Addiction is very complex. And so a lot of things can happen to lead someone to that moment in time where they're dealing with addiction. And it can take time and work on yourself as a friend or a family member to reach that place of, I'm trying to understand the why and I'm getting to that empathy.
You know, one of the things that when it comes to the why, you know, I don't think anybody wakes up and said, I want to be a drug addict or alcoholic today. But it usually starts in a process of, I use this and it made me feel a certain way. And then that process continues until the next thing you know, you're dependent on that substance. And I think that's the why, because no one ever sets out to say, I'm going to be when I get 35 years old, I'm going to be lost everything I had because of cocaine. And that's what happened in my life. But it didn't happen overnight. It was a process. And just like recovery is a process, so is addiction. And it starts slowly and then it picks up speed. And the difference between drugs and alcohol, in my understanding, is alcohol takes you a lot slower. Uh, so a person who is addicted to alcohol, they can last for years, but a person who is addicted to drugs, theirs usually come a lot quicker, and you lose stuff a lot quicker. So, but that why is you start and it makes you feel better, and next thing you know, you forget why you're using it. You just use it, and your life becomes difficult.
You know, and I think there's a real danger in, as we support a loved one, with needing to know the why, right? Lindy talks about how it opens up other doorways that you might not want to walk through, but also sometimes it's not necessary for us to be convinced that this is the reason, therefore it's okay that you are going through this right now. Because as you all have pointed out, being educated, doing your research, having empathy for the person, realizing that it's not about us, it's about them, can almost, I guess what I'm trying to say is, we wouldn't have to say why. We will simply be there to support our loved one. And maybe in the process, they will share with us why, right? So working on ourselves, that came out. I think Lisa mentioned that. Man, when I'm listening to you guys, it sounds like if I'm gonna support a loved one, I need to do some work, right? Like now, I don't know if I was up for that. I'm up for listening, but now you're telling me I need to work on myself. Let's talk about, like, what does that look like? You know, what type of work do I need to put in to be there for that person that is struggling with addiction?
I'll go back to say education, knowing your resources. I mean, that in a whole is very important. You can't understand the person that has the addiction until you really know your biases. If you have certain biases or have an image of a person who has an addiction, you know, sometimes stereotyping can get you stuck in how a person should look. And addiction comes in many forms and shapes, and it has no prejudices. It comes and it will get any of us at any given time that it happens. So you have to look at yourself and know your biases. You know, you got to know with what you can deal with and what you cannot. And if it's something that you can't deal with in the family, that's when you reach out and you go reach out for resources or help or outside friends that might have a story. Because if you have a bias, you're not going to be able to work with that person with an addiction if you already know in your mind what that person should be like and how they're going to go down this road. So you have to look at yourself on the bias and the stereotypes that you personally have as an individual.
So true, and such a hard thing to do and say, let me look at myself and look at my biases. But you're absolutely right. If you can't identify that either this is how I've looked at it and I can make a change to how I look at it, or this is how I've looked at it and I don't know how to look at it differently, and I need somebody else to be your support. You know, that might be the right decision, like you said, in your family or with your friend. And that's a better choice than to try to force yourself and not really be a good support for that person who needs you. It's definitely difficult. I think a lot of us, when I think of the things I was taught growing up about someone who uses drugs, I definitely have this picture in my mind of what that looks like and that that person wanted to be in that place. And as several of you have mentioned, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to face this. I want to deal with addiction. I want to become dependent on a substance. And so you definitely have to have a shift in your thinking of this person didn't probably choose to be in this place, and how can I support them? And maybe that means someone else has to support them because I'm not prepared and I can't get there internally. And again, that's a better choice than to try to force yourself when you're really not ready mentally and emotionally to be that support.
You know, and I think it goes back to preparation. Any intervention that I've been a part of, it's usually before we confront the person with addiction, you go in and you educate the family and let them, give them some education about this disease and help them understand what they're facing. And so it really takes preparation if you're really going to be serious about, because one of the things you learn is that whatever you say to the person that needs recovery, you got to be willing to walk through it and keep your word, because if you don't, then they'll think you're joking. And so you really have to be prepared and educated. And the family has to be the one that's educated, because they're the one who's going to have to make some of the tough choices.
Wow, your own biases. Wow, yeah. How do we work through those? So important. Recognizing them and being prepared. And this is so important too. Although we want to be there, as Lisa has pointed out, maybe we're not ready to be there. Right? I mean, because I think we can cause more damage if we're not ready to be there. And that's a really tough thing to be when you see your family member or your loved one. But that's that honest work that we need to do if we truly want to love and support someone with addiction. In our closing moments here, I want you to think of the person right now that has a loved one that is just struggling. They are just stuck in the mud. What advice, and I know we say get educated, but what advice would you give this person that they don't know how to approach them? They are just aware, but they're stuck in the mud. What advice would you give them?
You know, as a counselor, I think first when you have a family member that has an addiction, you have to first step back and kind of figure out where that person with the addiction want to be, because you can't force anybody into treatment. That's the first and foremost that I tell any family member that calls in and say, hey, I have a son, I have a husband, I have a daughter that is heavy on using drugs. What can I do? And I tell them all the time, first you have to allow them to want the treatment. If they don't want it, it's pointless for the family member to try to force something that the person with the addiction isn't ready for. You know, we have the 12 steps, and it says you have to accept and be ready. And if you're not there, then anything that you do as a family member it's not going to work. So, you know, I always tell my family member who calls in and asks or make those statements that I have a family member with an addiction, I have to say they have to be ready, and maybe they're not. And you have to be okay with that, and you just kind of support them from a distance, because there's nothing else you can really do if they're not ready. And it's a hard thing to swallow for a family member, because you're on that save. I want to save them. You're on that, I want them to be better. I know they can be better, but if that person isn't ready, there's just nothing you can really do. You just kind of have to sit back and encourage as much as you can, but you can't force anybody into treatment.
And, you know, Lynn, that ties also to, if you do reach out to that family member and say, I'm noticing this problem and I'm concerned, and they're not ready to seek treatment, that you're offering yourself as a safe place. That, hey, when you're ready, I'm here. If you want to talk another time, you call me. Be clear and say, hey, I'm here. I want to help you when you're ready. Letting them know that they have a safety net to reach out to, because maybe before that moment, they didn't think you would be there to listen. They didn't think you could offer non-judgmental help. So I think that goes back to that, look at those biases, think about, how am I gonna support this person and offer that support, even if they're not ready for it. Let them know I'm here, and when you're ready, I'm still here, because I still care. And I'm gonna add in there also, if you know that they are misusing opioids, that another really smart thing to do would be to have some naloxone. And naloxone is a drug that reverses an opioid overdose. It only works for an opioid overdose, but it can save someone's life in an overdose. And it is available for free across the state of Oklahoma. You can go to okimready.org/overdose, and there's a map of free locations. So again, if you know there's someone in your life abusing or misusing an opioid, that's a step you can take, that if they do have an overdose, you could save their life with that.
One of the things that when someone calls me and they have a loved one that's using drugs or alcohol, the first question I usually ask, are they ready to stop? Because if they're not ready to stop, then all your outreach that you're doing is not going to help. And it reminds me of a story I heard early in counseling, early in recovery, about this couple that went to see a doctor about their son who had an addiction. And while they were sitting there talking to the doctor asked him, "Where is your son?" And they said, "Oh, he's out skiing." And so the doctor said, "Well, the first thing you have to do is help them have a problem." And so one of the things that we have to do is make sure that you're willing to make those tough choices, make those, to cut off the water, if you will, to really help that person if you really want to, for them to stop. But the first thing, they have to stop. And then you have to be willing to do the tough work and do that tough love we talk about sometimes. And sometimes tough love is just be willing to say whatever you promised them, you got to make sure that you're willing to go through with it. And, even for myself, I was thankful for a pastor that told my wife to give me one more chance. But after that one more chance, she also got a chance to watch me and see me go to Alcoholics Anonymous and do those things for my recovery. And if I hadn't have done those things, she would have left. And so you got to be willing to walk this thing out and not just talk about it.
Wow, a lot of great information, and I can only believe that, you know, it's going to be valuable for people to hear the things that you have shared and apply that to their lives, and also, you know, walk through this with their loved one, because it's not easy. And I just want to applaud all of you for the work that you are doing in these areas, and I just thank you for your sacrifice, because I know it's difficult as well. And this has been our panel on supporting a loved one who has an addiction, and we thank you.